Hey, what's up everyone? Today I'm going to share a few details about how we grow these 1-year-old Japanese black pine and how we're going to bare root them and ship them out this coming January. All right, well, we grow these in a greenhouse, and so the needles on them are a little bit thinner than they would be if they were out in full sun, but I think it gives a more vigorous seedling for the first year worth of growth to happen in the greenhouse, at least here in San Francisco, since we get kind of a cold summer. This is an Anderson seedling flat, and same thing that I used to put Anderson tree bands in. This one has just some coarse perlite on the bottom, and then my regular seedling mix of perlite and cocoa above that. These sit in the greenhouse on mesh benches, and the bottoms are mesh as well. So the roots don't really have a chance to go down and circle around on the bottom. And when they're sitting on the mesh benches, they're pretty much air pruned on the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and pull a few of these out, and I usually do this just by kind of sticking a tweezer in here and kind of loosening the soil. I can also dump it out entirely, but the idea here is that we're going to be kind of pulling these out. They might have a little bit of soil left on them, or they might be completely bare root like this, and then wrapping them in sphagnum. The root structure here is something that we're going to work on. So let me pull a few more of these out, and then I'll go through the root structure and what you can do when you receive them to improve it for the following years. All right, so I've got a pile of 1-year-old pine trees here. And as you can see, the roots are not like a perfect display in terms of creating an informal upright, but this is just step one in many steps, and so we're going to continue working on the roots. So as these are going to be shipped out, they'll be in these bundles of 5. I'm going to pack them in some sphagnum moss and then wrap them in some plastic to keep the roots happy during shipment, but minimize the amount of weight. So this is what the bundles will look like when they arrive. The key thing here is that we're shipping these while the plants are dormant, and that means that they can tolerate root work. The aftercare is important, but it's not as difficult, and you're not going to kill the plants by doing this to them during their dormancy period. Whenever I work with batches of trees, I like to use, certainly more than one, but I think 20 is about my best batch number because it's not too many to deal with, but it's also enough that you can do a number of different styles when you're starting something like 20 plants. And the more plants that you have of a given species, the more of an expert you'll become on growing that species. And that's why I tend to encourage people to not just have one pine tree or one juniper or one crabapple, but to have multiples of the same tree so that they can compare them. So what I'm doing here is just giving this guy a little bit of a root trim. I want to remove any roots that are, well away from the rest of the roots. And I also want to trim any long roots. So I've trimmed these to about 2 inches long. We're going to go ahead and pot up some of these after I trim the rest. So for the first example here, I've got just a 3.5 inch container, which is what we use for a lot of plants in the nursery, and I've got some coarse soil in the bottom because it's got some pretty large drainage holes there. The type of container you use will affect the root growth, but it will also affect the vigor of the plant. The larger the container, the more vigorous plant typically you have. I'm going to take some of the same mix that I just took them out of, and in this case I'm just reusing the same soil. I'm going to kind of hold this in the container. There's a few extra roots in here, and I've left it kind of low in the container for now. The divisions in the roots that I just analyzed are relatively low, and then I'm kind of pulling it up as I add the soil because I actually don't want the roots to kind of splay out like this. or to go, you know, up or something like that. I want the roots to mostly be going down towards the bottom of the container, and putting it in low, adding a little bit of soil, and then kind of pulling up the stem. I'm making those roots go down like that to ensure that I don't end up with any weird angles. If you were going to make an informal upright, especially a small tree where you were concerned about the root spread, I would recommend that you do something like this. You're probably thinking, well, what about the seedling cutting technique? These are not seedling cuttings. I find that the seedling cutting technique doesn't give me the root structure that I'm really looking for, so I stopped doing it because it slows down the growth rate of the trees in the first year. And it's a lot of work. If you're planning on making really small trees, it's not a bad idea to wire the pine trees at this point at the end of their first year of growth. And the reason for that is, depending on how vigorous a growth you get in the second year, you might have too much wood in the trunk to get really tight, sharp bends. If I was going to try to make mame or shohin sized trees, I might start by adding a little bit of movement and even some twists like I've done with junipers. You could pot this directly into like a tiny bonsai container, like a mame bonsai container like this, but that's going to really slow down the growth. The advantage of doing this with such a young plant is that you're not fighting as much of the roots. It might seem a little bit risky, but at this stage I could probably cut off pretty much all those roots. Just a caveat that the aftercare is important. So because it's fall right now and we're heading into winter, if you're going to be getting freezing temperatures, you don't want to be doing root trimming. We're actually not going to be shipping these out until January. January will be past the winter solstice, and that means that the root growth is going to be sitting there waiting for some warm temperatures. So if you do root trimming, just protect the trees from those cold temperatures. And even, you know, bare root trees, don't allow them to freeze, but that's true for almost all bonsai. Now, for consistency's sake, I would actually recommend that you put all of them in the same container, but I am giving you different examples just to give you different ideas about how you can treat these moving forward. This one has a pretty long stem, and that means that it's going to be harder to make it into a small tree or even a shohin. So maybe this will end up being a medium-sized tree. In order for that to happen, I'm gonna add another piece of wire, and in fact, I'm gonna go ahead and wire all three of these. All right, so if you're gung-ho and you really want to give your tree as much room as possible to grow, then you can go ahead and put it directly into a larger growing container. This is a 6-inch pond basket that I use for growing them out. Sometimes I will transplant them in year one into these, but oftentimes it's not until after the end of year 2. So you can do year 2 in the 3-inch container and then step it up here again. That gives you the opportunity to take another look at the roots, trim them back, make sure you've got a really perfect root display before it goes into this basket, which hypothetically it would stay in for a number of years. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put this one in here. I have wrapped the wire around the roots so that the roots are not splaying out at all angles, because that causes all kinds of problems as the wood begins to form. So I've also added some movement here, and you can use whatever movement you want, but keep in mind, the larger the trunk that you're going for, the more exaggerated you need to make the movement at this stage. Think about just every part of this being a lot bigger. It'll kind of start to fill in the curves and they'll look less dramatic as it gets bigger. I think I dropped a couple of the seedlings, but anyway, you get the idea. Basically, straight up repot, but do pay attention to the roots. The reason we work with young trees is that we want to make sure we're paying attention to things like the structure of the roots. So don't skip those steps. And thanks everyone for watching. If you want to get some bare root Japanese black pine, these are the Alameda seed source that are 1 year old. You can check them out on bonsaify.com, and we'll be shipping them out in mid-January of 2022.